started. Bryan actually asked me last semester if we could have some sessions on this, and I thought it would really be wonderful because I think we all want to teach better, and we have ideas for how that might work. But Bryan has actually done a lot of work on testing those hypotheses and finding out whether that actually did work or not. So that's what he's going to do, 2 sessions on this. And so this is the first one, and you're getting in on the ground floor. So take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to do 2 sessions because I've had actually a lot of my colleagues actually ask for me to host a session like this. More so, a lot of you have asked, or a lot of those who are not in the room have asked more so for part 2 of the presentation that I'm going to give probably in March, which is questions about doing research in general, and also what is the appropriate process to submit an IRB application and what does that entail. And in this context, if you're doing research in the classroom, how much of that requires IRB review and what does that look like? And I've had a lot of questions about that in the last few months, and so I'm going to cover that probably sometime in mid to late March, so we're not going to get to that today. Today I've got way too many things to say about rationale behind researching your teaching and sort of practical ways of how you're going to do that. So essentially that's going to be my objective today, is to give you maybe some tools that you have forgotten from your other degrees from back in the day, or maybe some things that you need a refresher on, or some things you've never even heard of before, on how to conduct research, but in the classroom, for the sole purpose of making your teaching a little bit better. To start though, I want to confess. I want to use this audience as a time of confession, because I am very guilty of doing this, and this being coming up with what I think is a really good idea in the classroom, coming up with something that I think is maybe a novel technique or a new way of teaching it, and not doing due diligence to make sure that what I'm doing is actually effective. Most recently, this was in my Intro to Research Methods and Stats class. I had my students complete a semester-long survey project where I thought that if they had to find their own surveys and collect their own data and analyze these data, and then maybe even put those results into a poster, that maybe if they had that learning experience, they would take all the different pieces of my class and they would get it. It would make sense. It would be applicable. It would be interesting. I would see more students going on to do upper level research classes. I thought this is going to get them engaged because it's more active learning, and it fits a lot of pedagogically what I study. And it blew up in my face. For one thing, it absolutely did not work. Students were put off by it. They thought it was too difficult. Just give me a big paper to write, or just give me a test to take. Why do I have to do all this extra work? Oh my God. But the other problem, though, this is where I have to make my confession, is that semester that I tried this, I never once officially assessed what it was that I did. I thought that it was a good idea, and I tried it out, and I kind of heard the complaints anecdotally, and I saw students' scores on this project, but I never systematically investigated, was this actually a good idea? Did it actually change my students' opinions, which I hope that it did? Or does it help them kind of put all these pieces together from the class? I don't know. I just thought it was a good idea, and I kind of went with it. And I do that in my other classes too. I'll look for anecdotally students' experiences and say, oh, that felt good, or that lecture, or that demo, or that discussion, I felt like I want to keep doing that next time. And I never actually test to see if that's a good idea, if it's effective. They enjoyed it, but does that mean they learned from it? Does that mean that it's something that I should keep using? That is not what I'm talking about today. So my confession is, I as a teacher do this all the time, think that it's a good idea, but never officially test the effectiveness of that idea. So what I want to talk about today is sort of the research process behind how do you test if these ideas are effective, if they are doing whatever it is that you want them to do, improving attitudes or learning or whatever it is. So that's what I'm talking about today is SoTL. We abbreviate that. Sometimes we call it SoTL, which is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. It is a bridge of my 2 favorite things. It's doing research, which is what my degree is in, experimental psychology. But it's also my other favorite thing, which is classroom stuff. So doing research on classroom stuff to see if that is actually effective with students. So that is the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I'm borrowing the definition from a couple of people in my own field, and the definition is kind of a 4-part definition. So as I would in a class. I'm only going to give you a piece of that definition a little bit at a time so you can kind of digest it one bullet point at a time. And the first part of it is exactly what I just said. Like SoTL in this presentation is all about trying to find a systematic way of getting your students to learn better through your teaching. But it's not just trying new things and saying, well, that felt right, or it looked like it worked, or their scores were better this semester than it ever has been before. That's not SoTL. SoTL is much more systematic. It's much more purposeful in your research. It really, really feels like you're doing the research that you might have had to do to get your PhD, or that you might have had to do at that time in a project you didn't want to. It follows a very similar path of doing research, but you're doing it on what we're all here to do, which is teaching and teaching well. Not only that, though, SoTL follows the established criteria that are needed to do research well. So we're kind of talking about the scientific method here in terms of defining your variables and testing the variables and statistically analyzing them with the right steps and disseminating those findings. That's what I mean by established or validated criteria of scholarships. That's what Potter and Kustra meant. It's knowing your science and applying it to your teaching so that you can better understand if your teaching is effective. So is your demonstration or your homework assignment or your project or whatever it is that you do well, is it actually changing students' beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, values, or whatever learning means to you? Are they doing better on a test? That's good, but are you doing something more as an instructor beyond just changing their memorization or their recap on an exam? And finally, SoTL is also set apart because it's all about dissemination. It's more than just me for my sake knowing if I'm a good teacher, or me for my students knowing if they're getting something out of this. It's also about letting other people know that what you've done here is effective. Hey, you can take my idea and you can use it in your own class. You can adapt or borrow or steal something of mine, so that it's not just something that's stuck in my classroom, because I think we do that too often too, is we've got a really cool, really effective idea, but we don't talk about it, we don't publish it, we don't present it at a CTE session. So that's what SoTL is all about too, is sharing the gospel of your good teaching, essentially. So that's what I want to talk about today, just giving you a working definition of SoTL. Now, here's kind of the process. This is kind of the overview of what SoTL looks like. And again, this overview is going to look really familiar to those of you who are familiar with the research process, because it is research, essentially. SoTL should be approached as you would approach research, with curiosity and motivation, intention to learn something new. And you're using the same steps as I use in my lab, as I use in my classroom, as you would in your labs or in your recitation sections or in your whatever it is that you're doing. You're going to use this kind of process because you're curious to see if it helps students improve. So developing a research question is obviously the first thing we got to start with, and we're going to cover that today, is what is it that you want to know from your class, or what is it that you do well in your class? Number two is also what I'm going to try to cover today, is how do you use research methods to address the question that you want to answer? And there are correct methods for your question, and there are incorrect methods for your questions. Some best practices to follow and some not so good ideas that we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Those are my two objectives today. We're not going to hit the others in this session. But session number 3 is once you have an idea and once you have some concrete processes, can you get those passed by the IRB? Do you want to do things, say, unethical to your students? We can talk about some really fun unethical studies done in the classroom another time. But that is part of the process, is making sure that someone on the IRB knows what you're doing and is okay with what you're doing. Number 4 is collecting not any data, but it's collecting the right data. I use the word appropriate here because if you want to measure student attitudes about a topic, for me, I teach research methods and stats. I want to know if my students' attitudes toward this topic, which typically they fear or they loathe, I want to know if their attitudes improve as a result of some of my in-class activities or projects or papers or whatever. So I've got to make sure that the measures that I choose are valid, that they're measuring what they're supposed to measure, that they're good, valid measures of attitudes and not just something that's peripheral or not distinctive. And of course, number 5 is once you've collected the data, you've got to analyze those data. running them through the appropriate statistics, or running them through the appropriate analysis, whether that's qualitative analysis or something. Running those appropriately can tell you whether or not your teaching, your demonstrations were actually effective. When you're done with that, this is where a lot of us fall short. Number 6, we don't disseminate enough those results. And I want to stop here for just a second, because if you're not bought in yet, let me try to buy you in with kind of 3 reasons why you want to pursue SoTL. Dissemination of your results might be the main reason why we do this. For one reason, our students. We want to be better teachers so that we can actually better improve our student learning, outcomes, attitudes, beliefs, whatever it is. So you're trying to be intentionally a better teacher for them. But if that doesn't sell you and you're like, well, I'm already, okay, that's fine. I get it. That's fine. You're great. You're perfect. That's fine. But number 2, scholarship. There's this little item on your PAC at the beginning of every year that you have to add. And I'm going to tell you that this is low-hanging fruit. Especially at Lee, because you're having to teach 4 or 5, this semester 6 classes for me. You're having to teach so many classes and come up with all new ideas and projects. Why not, under scholarship, have one of these things as your goals? I want to try this idea in my class and see if it's effective. That's what I did a year ago. I'll show you some of those data and some of the stories behind that. But that was one of my scholarship ideas, is I want to do research on teaching because I'm at Lee and that's what we're supposed to do well. So why not try to systematically investigate if I'm doing that well? And then number 3, I'm going to tell you that of all the research that I do, my own research with students, and research on teaching, this is the most simple kind of research, the most simplistic level of research that anyone could do. It doesn't take long. It doesn't take a lot of resources or time. Right now, I have one student who is helping me do these studies. Some of you participated in that study, that survey link that I sent out a week or 2 ago, and I appreciate that. We have over 110 different responses right now that are going to give us a good idea of whatever it is that we're studying. And it doesn't really take much effort, as opposed to my other research in my lab. It takes sometimes hundreds of dollars to buy the stimuli. It'll take weeks and weeks of collecting data and excluding and analyzing data. This kind of research is so easy to do that I feel like it fits well with Lee's mission, and it fits well in your PAC, and it fits well with, I think, a personal mission of just being a better teacher. So I feel like this is what we should be doing at Lee on a regular basis if research is something that you're comfortable with, and if being a better teacher is something that you are comfortable with too. So I want to talk about items number 1 and 2, developing a research question and using methods to answer that question first. Before I jump into that, do you have any questions about what I've covered so far? I have a habit of doing that in my classes. Stop, pause, ask a question, cup of tea. Any questions at all? Okay, then let's dive in. Okay, so this is an outline of what SoTL looks like that I found in my field, in my literature, which is going to look a little bit different in psychology than it is maybe for nursing or for math or for communications. It's going to look a little bit different. But broadly speaking, SoTL for everyone's discipline looks like this. You start out, I hope, with motivated curiosity about why students are performing or how to improve student performance. That's where this always has to begin. And you're in this session probably because you're curious, you're intentional, you're systematic. So I think you've got step 1 covered. I think you're okay. But number 2 here, this is where time has to be taken. Knowing what it is that's been done in your field in terms of teaching techniques, reviewing the literature and figuring out what question you want answered. That's the part that might take a little bit of effort and a little bit of time. So we're going to do that today. And then step 3, systematically collect, analyze, interpret, and then maybe even disseminate those data if appropriate. More importantly, too, is if you find that whatever it is that you've done works, you keep doing it. You keep using it. This new instructional technique that I have found in one of my classes that I'll tell you about later, I'm using it every semester because I saw real time how this improves students on a variety of levels. And it was absolutely something that I will never trade, never do anything differently because systematically it works. And so I'm also disseminating that here. I talked about it at a conference somewhere. It's something that I think is important in this whole process. Now, also depending on your discipline, SoTL is going to look very different in how you approach this. This is a broad prescription that applies to anyone in the room, no matter your discipline. And also what I'm going to give you here, these 3 major types of SoTL also applies to anyone in the room. So I'm not going to get very discipline specific just yet. But 3 different ways that you can approach this. And this is, I hope, going to start getting you thinking about, okay, what research question do I have? Like, what do I want to know about teaching or about learning or about students? So let me give you these 3 broad categories. Number 1, most of us, when we think of SoTL, we think of doing research on individual or specific classes. So maybe you want to gather students' data in this class that you have, Math 161 or Psych 210 or a communications writing film class, something like that. You want to know if in this class some specific technique that you're using is actually effective. So you pick that thing out in that one class and you say, okay, I want to know if this is making a difference, if this is helping students. Or, this is what I do most commonly. I like to make comparisons of courses or students. Like, I like to compare my course to a different similar course to figure out if what's happening with my students can be mirrored in it or is totally different from a different course. Or maybe I have one course and I make comparisons within different groups of students in that class. So if I have maybe one large group of students and I want to know if a subsection of that population is different from a different subsection, that's an interesting comparison for me because that's my training, that's experimental psychology, that's how I think. Or for some of you who you're not really comfortable with that, you want to choose option number 3. You can do SoTL by doing a meta-analysis, which is a big statistical literature review over a specific teaching technique in your field. And you want to know maybe, what has the last 200 studies or 50 or 20 studies on this thing, what have those studies said about the effectiveness of this technique? Not my wheelhouse, not my expertise, not my interest. To do a lit review for a semester it just sounds awful. It sounds boring. It sounds like a dissertation all over again, and I'm kind of over that. So my focus is going to be items 1 and 2. How could you do research on your classes or compare research in other classes that you're doing? That I think is more useful and more productive for my training and my purposes. So let's start with step number 1. How do you develop a research question? That may be for some of you the hardest step to really go with because maybe you have no idea what it is that you want to study. Now, if you're in here in this room, you probably have either curiosity or motivation, or maybe you're clever and you've tried some really interesting things in your class. I guarantee that most of us have tried something before. Something new, something risky, you didn't know if it was going to work, but you didn't investigate it through the lens of SoTL. I think that you should. I think that you should try to see if your research question is valid, to see if those ideas play out. But if you have no idea, if you're like, I'm not really sure what I want to know, let me give you some ideas about how to start with this question, okay? First of all, the easiest thing to do for some, not for me, but for some people who are very clever, very resourceful, is to identify something brand new. Most of the time in SoTL, especially today, teachers are going toward technology-related interventions because that's what our students are plugged into, They're used to mobile phones, they're used to iPads, they're used to clickers, they're used to fill in the blank. A lot of SoTL in all of your disciplines is right now really angling in this direction. And a lot of you use technology in very, very clever ways. I'll give you some examples of that here in a little while. But right now, it's low-hanging fruit to say, well, I wonder if this app is helping my students in this class, because a lot of you use apps or use websites, graphing calculators and technology, but you've never actually tested those ideas. That honestly is maybe an easier way to say, well, they've never actually tried it in my discipline, but they've tried it in someone else's discipline before. So what if clickers do work for intro psych classes, but they don't work for a nursing class? Do we know that in your literature? That's a good question. So if you're curious about that, and if you find technology to be kind of a passion of yours, that would be a good place to go. Now, if not, if novelty is not your wheelhouse, and it's not mine, because I don't think that I'm a creative person, I'm not clever, I'm a good thief. I'm a good borrower. I'll find what someone else is doing well, and I'm going to try to steal it and adapt that. That's my training, is thievery and criminality. Then what I do most typically is I go into the literature in my field, and I look around for ideas to steal. That's what I do. I'm a member of the Society for Teaching of Psychology, and every month, it's every quarter, they give me a journal of wonderful ideas that I can steal. It's fantastic. I don't have to think up these clever manipulations. I don't have to think up clever demonstrations, because I just don't think that way. But oh my goodness, I can steal those M&M's ideas, and how I can talk about the standard distribution with M&M's. Oh, I would never have thought of that on my own, but I can steal their idea. And then I can ask the question, would that actually work at Lee? Would that work for my students? Maybe it works for state schools, for a student of a different mindset. Maybe this technology or maybe this technique doesn't work on religious students, maybe this discussion that they've had in this literature won't fit my class. So it's still worth trying these ideas, even if you find it in the literature. Some of my students, they too often throw their hands up in the air and they say, well, somebody's already done this, so there's no point in trying. There's no point in doing this again. I don't think that that's a legitimate excuse. I think that if it's been demonstrated effective somewhere, we should replicate that. We should try that in our own classes. We should use it. We should steal it. That's good science. That's good teaching. So in this, you have to ask yourself, what's been done before? That does require you to dive into your discipline's literature in SoTL. Or, if we have time, I'll show you, there is actually an open source SoTL journal that applies to all disciplines on the web. You can look it up. If you don't have one in your own discipline, go here and you can steal some of those open source ideas and see if you can adapt those, research those, publish those, totally free for you to steal. I've done that. It's great. What has been done in this area before? You ask yourself the question, am I doing anything different from my colleagues? Do my teaching evaluations, for example, reflect that I'm doing something different than my peers? If so, what are you doing different? Is it your personality? Might be. But it also might be that the way that you lead a discussion, the way that you frame a final project or a paper, it might be the debate that you host in class or the lab experience that they have. It might be that you're doing it slightly different, and that's worth researching a little bit further. You've got to be doing something that makes you, you. So what is that? What is it that in the classroom students respond to, that anecdotally you look at and you say, you know what, they really like this, or they really grow from this, they really learn from this? Don't just keep guessing that it works. Grab that thing and make it a part of your scholarship of teaching and learning. And then finally, steal it. If it's been done before, modify it. Use it for your class. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why I am here. I am giving you something to steal from one of my experiences that I'll tell you about shortly. That's what teaching and research are supposed to be. So if you're stuck and you're thinking, I really don't know where to start here. Start by stealing, borrowing, looking in the literature, open source or your discipline, or look at some technology-related ideas. I wonder if these translators, would they help or hurt my students in my classes? These calculators, are they really helping my students conceptually understand these math concepts, or are they actually limiting their ability to put all of these different points together? Figure out what it is in your classroom to do. Now, I'm going to give you some specific examples here, just a list from my cursory review of SoTL about research questions. You want to steal or adapt these, that's fine, but these are some of the ones that I found interesting in the last little while. This is the broad question that I have in the back of my mind when I want to do SoTL. Does my activity or my homework assignment, my project, my paper, my test, my group experience, my project-based learning, whatever it is, does that actually help my students? Now that's vague, that's broad. I've already kind of mentioned that before. So if I broke that down and made it more specific, here are some examples that I've been able to steal. And I'll talk about that point in just a second. One point that is of wide debate. Should I let my students take notes in class, handwriting their notes or typing them up on a laptop or an iPad or a phone or using papyrus or something? I don't know what you do. That's a great question that emerged from my literature in my field, which, by the way, spoiler alert, suggests repeatedly that students who are taking notes by hand are processing and retaining the material at a more deep level than those who are typing it up on a mobile device, on a laptop or something. Now, mind you, I actually don't ban laptops or mobile devices. I don't have a policy on that. But I think it's an interesting research question that if you have a technology policy in your class, or if you encourage students one way or another to take notes, is that helping or harming them? You can investigate that in your own field. Maybe it doesn't work for your field. Maybe because your students are so computer adept, they're actually accustomed to these devices more. So they're going to be better in that sample than maybe a population who is not as accustomed to use it. That's a great research question. Maybe. Here's one that I've borrowed before. Manipulatives. A word that I've only learned recently by working on a grant with Dr. Boulis. Manipulatives. Dr. Robinson calls them toys. Can toys in the we call them toys now. Yeah, that's our term. We call them toys now. Can toys in the classroom help students learn a concept better? There are concepts in my research methods and stats classes that are just impossible to explain. And even if I show students graphs and I let them play with real data, they just don't seem to get it. So I found in one of my articles in my field an article about M&Ms and how if you bring everyone one of those small little Halloween candy bag of M&Ms and you do a demonstration on the standard error of the mean, how for whatever reason it seems to make sense when they can eat their data. When maybe that's what it is. Maybe there's just the consuming. You're just consuming this. And this tastes good and it's fun. I don't know. Or using playing cards when you're teaching probability theory, or when you're breaking people up into groups. However you think you can use toys in your class, is that actually effective? Maybe you don't use them. Maybe you don't need them. That's fine. But that's just an idea. I know that Dr. Milliron teaches intro psych, and he has the students use clickers, response systems a lot. The ones that we attempt to use in faculty meetings a lot, when we're trying to vote. Are they actually effective at keeping students engaged? I don't use clickers, but I actually use the website Poll Everywhere. It's totally free, and it works the exact same way. I can type in a question for my students to respond to, and in real time, I get students' attitudes, opinions, experiences, answers to informal quizzes. And the question is, okay, so it's interesting. It's shaking them up from lectures, but is it actually helping them? Like, systematically, are you investigating if the clickers are doing a good job? That's for you to decide. Another example. This is one that plagues me, and if anyone wants to host a CTE session, I'll be in front row for you. When we get observed by our department chairs, and they ask at the end of them, did they spend the last 5 minutes of class kind of recapping what was discussed in class? I'm going to tell you, I get dinged for that every semester. Most of the time, I get dinged for it on purpose because I don't like doing it. I don't like how unnatural it feels for me to say, okay, class, let's stop for a moment. Let's review. That's fine. And I understand why. It's a great idea. There's an article in my discipline also that effectively demonstrates this is the right way to do teaching. And that's why it's on our observations. It's a good way of kind of bookending a class session. But I don't like it. I'll just tell you, I loathe. And it's so awkward and it's so weird. And I have to force myself to do it on the day that my chair is there. And if he were here, I'd tell it to him, and he knows it. I only do it for him. And otherwise, I'm not going to do it because I still haven't found the best way to do it. I don't know what works. And I've tried lots of different things. I've tried the note cards. I've tried 1-minute papers, think, pair, share. Just nothing feels right. So if you've got a clever idea, talk to me after this thing because I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe that should be my next SoTL project. I don't
figure out some way to get M&Ms in there.
I probably that's what it is. For every sort of novel point that you explain well, I'm going to throw you some candy. Very Skinnerian. I'm going to give you candy. I like that idea.
It worked for me.
Whatever works for anybody. I'm curious because systematically I don't know what works because I haven't found it yet. So your question is, what is your question? What do you want to know? You've got to figure this out. I'm going to give you this. Just take one of these and pass it around. And this is going to, I hope, spark some other ideas as you're trying to think about doing research to make your teaching better. It's a worksheet that I stole online. Didn't make this myself. But I stole it because it actually forces you after you leave here to think about some of these issues rather than just say, you know what, I got it, I heard him. Great, it's no, this is like very practical questions. If you can answer these questions honestly to yourself, you are starting the SoTL process. And if you see here, number 1, think about a teaching or learning issue, problem, or question that you have about your students, about a course, about an assignment, a pedagogical strategy, a program, whatever it is. Think about one of those things. What is one of those things that you might want to study? That's up to you. Oh, there you go. That's up to you to study. And if you have no idea, if you're still at a loss and nothing's inspired you, I'll honestly say this. We may not know each other, but you are free to email me and say, you know what, I try these things in my class. How do I translate that into a research question? I'll be more than happy to help you figure this thing out. I can do that better than I can come up with my own questions. So feel free to send me an email if doing something like this is still escaping you, okay? Any questions about that before we dive into step 2 for the rest of our time here? Okay, so here we go. Step 2 in the SoTL process, once you've figured out what it is that you want to know, you then have to actually test the question using appropriate research methods. So what I'm going to do now is first apologize, because what I'm about to do to you is I'm going to give you kind of a 10 to 15 minute research methods and statistics overview. So you're going to kind of retake an old class that might cause some flashbacks. The counseling center is up the road if you need it afterwards. I'm going to give you 4 research methods that SoTL teachers typically use to answer their questions. 4 very practical things that you can walk out of here and say, you know what, I can do that. You know what, I could probably use this next week in one of my classes. 4 methods that we're going to talk about. The first one is here, the simple correlational method. Easiest, most sort of basic approach to doing research in the classroom is the correlational research method. The whole purpose of this method is not manipulation. It's not bringing something new to the classroom. It's not changing your student's environment. It's measurement. That's the whole purpose here. Whatever it is that you're already doing, or whatever variables in your class you want to know more about, attitudes, learning, passion, rapport, whatever it is that you think is interesting to study, the correlational method is all about you primarily just measuring those things. That's it. You're looking for relationships. You're looking for associations. You're not necessarily looking to see if this thing that you're measuring causes changes in people's behavior. You're not necessarily asking, does this project cause my students to love psychology better? Is there a relationship there between this assignment, this test, this clicker, this relation, whatever it is? Is there a relationship there that I might be able to then use to better understand my students a little bit more? I'll give you a bunch of examples here in just a minute. This particular method is appropriate for you. And each method that I'm going to talk about has correct uses and incorrect uses, so you've got to be careful here. This is an appropriate method to use if you've got, say, a single class that's not large enough to divide up into smaller groups. P.S. Let me just say this real quick. I'll mention it later, but I want to make sure I say it now. When we talk about groups in SoTL, the acceptable minimal number of students in a group is 10. That's kind of a rule of thumb that if you're going to break students up and investigate them using kind of the research methodology, 10 is the bare minimum. You need more, you should have more, but if you have a small class and you can at least get 10 in a group or 10 in a whole class, then it's okay to do a lot of what I'm going to talk about here. So if you have a single group of students that can't be divided, if you've got 10 people or 12 people or even 15 people, don't break them up. That's fine. Just use this correlational method. And you only have a session to collect the data. Maybe that means one classroom session. Maybe that means a week or a lab or a semester, whatever that means to you. If you've only got one shot, this method is appropriate because it doesn't take a lot of time, it doesn't take a lot of resources. But there are some cases in which it is not appropriate to pursue this particular method. Okay? For example, you should not use this if causality is your concern. And for a lot of us it is. I want to know if my project is the reason why my students' attitudes improved. That's causality. It's not appropriate to be doing this. Just measuring attitudes and learning, just measuring whatever it is you're interested in, does not in any way allow you to infer causality, because causality only comes from control and random assignment and a couple of other research methody things that we're not really going to talk about today. The other issue is, if you have fewer than 10 people, you probably are not going to be able to publish the results of your correlational design. That being said, with fewer than 10 people, you should still research, you should still ask and collect data from students, but in terms of the SoTL literature, it's not going to work, because with fewer than 10 people, you have too much variability in your data. The effect of outliers is going to be too great. Statistically speaking, you're not going to have enough power to detect the things that you want to detect. So small sample sizes below 10 are really going to inhibit your ability to actually publish these results. Presenting them, you'll probably be okay, but an editor or a reviewer is probably not going to pass you or look at your results kindly if you have so few students. And one thing I want to say about this really quickly, though, is you can get around that if you collect correlational data over time. If you have multiple classes or across multiple semesters where you're collecting the same data, then you have a larger sample size, then you have something that gives you the statistical power that you're looking for. So if you right now you're in a class and you're thinking, well, I'm only teaching like 8 students, collect the data anyway, and then collect it again next time, and then collect it again the next time. And then you will have a body of data that will be publishable in the future. So don't discount yourself if you're only teaching a small class or a small lab, because that's not going to count you out. It will immediately, but not in the long run. Now, here's an example that I want to give you about this research. Someone in my field, Baker, wanted to know about online teaching. Just correlationally speaking, is online teaching actually doing our students any good? By the way, it's a great question to ask. Are my students, for example, getting a similar experience in an online class than they would be in, say, an on-campus class? That's a great question. It's not a correlational question, but it's a great question. Baker just wanted to know, are students in my class, in this online version, are they equally motivated? Are they actually showing up to the discussion threads or watching the videos or reading the texts? Are they responding to the instructor's immediacy, how often I'm available on video or in email or in person if that's an option? And is that influencing at all their grades or their engagement or whatever presence means for you in an online classroom? Baker is not changing the online class. Baker is not introducing a new initiative, a new project. Baker just wants to know, hey, is there a relationship between how well my students are doing and what else is going on in this class? Just measurement, that's all. So Baker would give students a series of surveys, maybe in one session, in one email. Just fill out these scales, and that's all. Baker can then run, and did run, a series of correlations, a series of analyses, and determine that these kinds of students were engaged and these were not, and these students did well and these students did not, and it's all very correlational. Now, I do this in my classes a lot. I'm very much a fan of the correlational method, because all I have to do is ask my students questions. And then statistically, I know how to run correlations in order to determine, are students who are using cell phones in my class, are they getting higher or lower grades? I'm not instituting a policy. I'm not creating a new assignment. I'm just asking a question and looking for real data in my sample. That's all I want to know. I can ask my students the question, does my prayer at the beginning of class, does that have any influence on your perceptions of spirituality? That's an interesting question. It's correlational. Maybe I'm curious if this prayer, if this faith integration, if it's making a difference in their perceptions of religiosity or their relationship with God or their spiritual wake, as Dr. Kahn sometimes calls it. I'm interested in those questions. All I have to do is ask questions. It doesn't take resources or time. You just need to know a little bit about your literature, need to know a little bit about what are the valid measures of those things you want to measure, and then give it to them after IRB approval, of course. That's the correlational method in a nutshell. Just measurement, not manipulation. Make sense? Not too bad. We can all do that very, very easily, especially given the number of classes that we teach here at Lee. It's pretty easy to do. You just got to find what it is that you want to measure. Design number 2. The one group pre-test, post-test design. what you're doing is you're taking one group of students, whether that's an entire class, a lab, or a small subset of your class, and you want to know if you can change their fill in the blank or improve their fill in the blank. You want to know if there's a change from before to after whatever it is that you've introduced into the classroom. So I am talking about manipulation here. I am talking about introducing something, paper, project, discussion, demonstration, whatever it is that you call it. This is introducing something into your classroom environment. And we call it, just most of the time, we just call it a pre-post test. You know, very, very simple comparison of baseline to after the fact. Is there a difference between these time frames? Very, very quickly. This is appropriate to use if you only have a few students. If you've only got one class, one section of that class. If you have, say, 10 or 12 students and you can't break those students down into smaller groups and you wish that you could compare those groups but you don't have enough students, that's fine. This is fine. And if you can't feasibly have a, quote, control condition in your SoTL. A control condition is when you have a group and they don't necessarily receive that intervention. They don't receive that project, that paper, that discussion, that thing. So that's what I mean by control condition or control group. If that's not feasible to you, then use this design. And by the way, every single one of you in the room can use that design. But it's inappropriate for two reasons. This is getting very methodsy, so I'm going to go over this very, very quickly. Very quickly. It is not appropriate to use if there are things that happen in your class between the pre and the post. Say that again. So you're going to measure, for example, at the beginning of the semester, their attitudes toward research methods and stats. I do this every time I teach Psych 215. Day one, what are your attitudes? Here is a measure. Now, at the end of the semester, post, I also measure those same attitudes in the same way. But what happens in the 14 weeks between pre or post? There's a lot of stuff that happens. I mean, there's lectures, there's discussions, there's tests, there's soapboxes from me. There's a lot of stuff that I do. Projects and, group discussions and different dynamics. We go collect data in the PCSU and we watch American Idol. There's a lot of stuff that we do in class together. I have no idea which of those things that I've done over the 14 weeks improves or lowers my students' attitudes, because we've done so many things. So when you do a pre-post design like this, you usually want to do it in a short amount of time, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, no longer than that, because you don't want a lot of other stuff to happen in your class other than your intervention to change their attitudes, their perceptions, their learning. You don't want that to happen. So that's what I mean by items other than the treatment, other than whatever it is you're introducing to your class. And you also don't want to use this design if students are likely to change between assessments, if they're likely to grow, if they're likely to mature, if they're likely to be a totally different person between pre and post assessments, which suggests that, if you do this longer than 2 weeks, then you are risking that your students are going to grow a little bit and kind of ruin, in a way, the effectiveness of your treatment. My example comes from my emotions class. I teach a Psych of Emotions class every fall, and I created this class 2 years ago in the fall. And I teach psychology of emotions. Maybe that's what you think of when you think of psychology, but I'm not a counselor. I'm not in touch with my emotions. I don't know what they are. That's why I teach a class on them, to try to understand them. I'm the research robot. And so I teach this class from a very research perspective. What is the science behind understanding human emotion? What I did in this class was my first semester teaching it, mind you. I had everyone take a battery of emotion assessments on the first day of class. How emotionally intelligent are you? Can you perceive emotions in other people? Do you have healthy beliefs about the expression and the experience of emotion? I want to know everything. So then I teach the class, and I teach a lot of different topics on emotion, and then I gave them a post test at the end of the semester. What I found in this class was that students at the end of the semester were more emotionally intelligent as per this self-report, okay, just a survey, but they reported being better in emotional intelligence, and they had more healthy beliefs about emotions at the end of the class as opposed to before. Again, there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case. A lot of things we do in the class. I have them do journals. I have them watch videos. There's a lot of stuff we do, a lot of active learning in this class. You'll notice, though, that they weren't any better off, any more emotionally well off at the end of the class. Not statistically significantly better, but still better. 3.6 is better than 3.5. That is math. But it's not statistically better.
That looks like your healthy beliefs went down.
Well, okay, so that's true. The way that it was measured, though, is lower number does mean healthier in this case.
Okay.
So that's just a scaling issue. Typically, we do think of higher means better, but in that particular scale, strangely, lower meant better. I should have transformed that to make the graph flip, but I just was lazy and didn't do that. So, but you're right. That's a good point. And that's a pre-test, post-test with one group of students. That's all I did, and that told me something about my assignments in class or the way I run the class, or something about it that I didn't know before. So now, every time I teach this class in the fall, I always have them do this battery of emotion tests. But let me take it a step further, because that's just, it's okay, it's not that great. So I took it a step further, and design number 3, I have tried to use the 2-group pre-post-test design. This one's a challenge. Because now, not only do I want to compare before and after with one group, I now need to do this with 2 different classes, or maybe 2 sections of the same class, which most of you are not really privileged to do. I get a chance to do that. I get to teach 2 sections of an intro methods course every fall, and one in the morning and one at night, so I can have 2 groups and I can compare different things between those classes. That's kind of nice to do. But the 2-group pre-post design is exactly what I just talked about, the same idea. Instead of having one group of students, though, you have, 2. That's why it's called a 2-group. You get the idea, right? So I'm doing pre-post, before and after, but I also want to know, in another person's class, or in another section of my own class, can I compare if there are changes from the beginning to the end of the semester? So this is only going to be valuable for those of you who have multiple groups or multiple classes available, which is really difficult to come by. Best case scenario, you use this if you do in fact teach multiple sections of the same course. Benevolence, that would be interesting. Gateway, maybe. If you perhaps teach global perspectives several times throughout the semester, that would be kind of cool. That would be appropriate if you have multiple groups. But I realize that the majority of us don't have the privilege of doing that. So another way of thinking about this design is, instead of finding the same class being taught multiple times, Math 161, what I have done and what is appropriate to do is find a similar class, not identical, but a similar class. Maybe it's being taught by a different instructor, research methods in communications. Michael, you taught that last year. And I could have compared my results to attitudes to your results to attitudes. That would be appropriate. Being taught by 2 different people, but it's still a good comparison. And it's also 2 different departments, different material, but it's still close enough to where my 2 groups could be taught. Or what I did is, in my same emotions class, the very next time I taught it, I had Dr. Ashcraft's. She taught lifespan development the same semester. She taught it at the exact same time as I did. We both have similar-ish personalities. I don't know. She's a lot more bubbly and a lot more lively and a lot more human than I am. So I give her a lot more credit. So she has a different approach to her classes than I do. But I still thought that because our classes were at the same time for the same amount of time with a relatively similar amount of students, and we're both talking about psychology and growth and development, that it would be a relatively good comparison. Not perfect, but it was close enough. So what I did is I had Susan's class do the same battery of emotions questionnaires, pre and post, in her lifespan development class, where you're not really talking about emotional development as much as you would be in my emotions class. And then when I made the comparisons between my class and her class from pre to post, we saw a slew of different results. Some things that were different and some things that were similar, and I don't have time to go into all those results. But it taught me something about my emotions class that, I can see over here, for example, in Susan's lifespan class. I'll tell you one cool result. Students had higher levels of emotional well-being after her class as opposed to before her class. I didn't see that in my class. You saw that on my graph a minute ago. But her class were better off in that category, which I thought was fascinating. So it kind of made me think, okay, so what is Susan doing in her class that is helping her students, grow, in my class not? There are other reasons why that could have been, by the way, because my students were mostly juniors and seniors, whereas hers were mostly sophomores and juniors. So there could have been the fact that my students were just older and there wasn't as much room to grow. It could be that, I don't know. But it was an interesting thing for me to think about and to continue researching. That's how I did it. 2 similar classes, not identical classes. Okay? I don't want to talk about that. Finally, within participants, because we're running out of time and I don't want to keep you past 5. The within participants design is also very, very common in SoTL research. It's really more common in research, but we do this in the classroom. And this, by the way, I don't have this on my slide, but I want to say this before I get too far. In my field, a lot of SoTL researchers argue that this might be the best method of all the methods I've discussed so far. It's debatable, but it might be the best method because it doesn't require you to spend a lot of time, resources, extra classes. What this particular method does is it allows you to make comparison within your own participants. So those are the 2 words here. Comparisons within your own classes. Another way of saying that is students in your class, each individual student is exposed to every level or every condition or every treatment or everything that you want to do. Every student is in every condition and every student is assessed after that condition. You're not comparing between classes, you're comparing within classes. It's very similar to the pre-test, post-test with one group that I talked about. But with the within subjects design, you can do a lot more than just give one intervention or one treatment or one activity. You can do multiple things with students. The example that I want to give you here at the bottom is that in one class in 2003, these teachers 1 week instructed students with overhead transparencies. That's all they used. The next week they used bland, plain PowerPoint slides. And then the 3rd week they used really interactive video, picture kind of PowerPoint slides. And at the end of each week, after each of these interventions were given, they assessed students' learning. They gave them a quiz to figure out, of these 3 different types of things that we're doing, which one helps you best. It sounds a lot like a pre-test, post-test, but you'll notice there's no pre-test here. We did 3 things. We compared those 3 things in one group of students over and over and over again. You can do that too. That's a within subjects design or within participants design. Now, I think I'm just going to skip past this. I can send you this PowerPoint slide so you can see some of these gold standards, but I don't have time to go through these enough. But from my discipline, we found that these 5 points, if you want the best kind of SoTL research imaginable, if you want to have the most airtight, statistically powerful ways of doing research, larger sample size, theory-driven hypothesis, and other types of really technical, researchy kind of things, those items, if you can manage it, would be ideal to include in your classes. Now, since we don't have time to discuss them, I'll say it again. If you have a question about this and you're thinking, I don't even know what double blind means, I don't know, I understand, it's fine, that's okay. Just email me, ask me. I will send you my PowerPoint, I'll send you my materials, my articles, whatever it is, to show you, I've got an idea. You might be able to craft it this way, you might be able to do it this way. I've got some ideas for you. And I also have this idea for you. If you're looking for ideas and you're looking for sort of research questions to borrow, go to indiana.edu's SoTL. Just type in SoTL Journal or SoTL Indiana, and you'll be able to pull up their open access free journal that's been going on for the last dozens and dozens of years. And you can borrow some of those techniques that they've used in multiple disciplines that'll get you started on your own SoTL project. That was fast and largely incomplete, but enough of what I told you, I promised you at the beginning, I would give you a beginner's guide to this. That's enough to make you dangerous. So do you have any questions about any of these things that I have quickly brushed through in 45 to 50 minutes? Okay.
When you do your pre-post test, is there a best practice that would go with that?
I'm gonna say yes.
Focusing on simple.
I would definitely say start simple. That's best practice number one. Number two is, keep the time frame short between when you assess pre, when you give that thing that you want to assess its effectiveness, and post. Keep that within 1 to 2 weeks, no longer than. Make sure that the assessment that is at pre and post is the same assessment. Because if you change the pre and the post assessments, if they're different things, maybe the reason you have different results between beginning and end is because you used a different measure at the end or at the beginning. So keep them the same, and keep your intervention clear. Make sure that that thing that you're introducing is the only thing that's changing within the time frame of measurement. That I would argue is kind of your cheat sheet for best practices. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Also, do you prefer Likert scales or yes/no questions, or?
My personal preference for statistical purposes is as often as possible to use Likert or sliding scales. Nominal data or qualitative data, yes/no kind of items, will actually limit your statistics dramatically. So the way I teach my students is I tell them this: if you limit yourself with the way they can answer the questions, you limit yourself with the kind of analyses you can run. So Likert and sliding scales and open-ended questions give you a larger toolbox of statistics to use. I do not recommend closed-ended or binary questions like yeses and nos. I don't recommend it. If I ask you, for example, are you a fan of Tennessee football? You can say yes or no, but it is far less useful for me if I ask you yes or no, do you like Tennessee football, than if I asked how much of a fan are you of Tennessee football, or how many games do you go to? That gives me a better gauge of your fanness than yes or no. So I would avoid that in any survey imaginable if I were you. Yeses and nos just don't work well. There are some cases where it's appropriate, but in my experience, statistically, I would avoid those.
I know this is part two, but how much do you have to do for IRB?
How much?
You have to get, when you do your stuff in your class.
The IRB is going to require you to submit everything that you're going to do. All of your measures, all of your interventions, any kind of stimuli, example stimuli, they're going to need all of those materials, and it usually takes 1 to 2 weeks for that to be reviewed. As long as it's ethically speaking, then it sometimes even takes less than that. So that's my short answer to that question.
Who is our IRB?
That is a wonderful question. So the official correct answer is Dr. Mike Freak over in Sciences. But the other answer is that he perhaps has vacated the chair of the IRB at this point, and that the chair is open at the point. So most people have been sending their IRB things to me. Because we have actually multiple IRBs. We have one university-wide IRB, and then we have small sub-ad hoc committees, and I'm the chair of one of those ad hoc committees. And since, Mike and so he just said, send everything to Bryan. So you can send it all to me, and I will divvy it.
If you're your IRB, you get it passed, right?
Well, no, actually, I have to recuse myself from my own reviews. I have to give it to my other 4 reviewers, unfortunately. But if it's exempt from full review, then, like if Merle, you were doing something in class that was easy, it would take the chair only to review it a day or 2 at the most. It wouldn't have to go to full review, but that's something we'll talk about maybe next time. If you have any other questions, see me afterwards. Hopefully this was in some way helpful to you. Email me if you need anything. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.